Hello, BookTube. I have another page 112 tag. For those of you who don't know what that is, there's a French literary prize, leave it to the French, where the judges are given only page 112 of each candidate for the long list. Not the title, not the author, and not the rest of the book. Just page 112, under the assumption that I think is largely valid, that it's the very beginning of a book that is most heavily gone over by the writer, by his beta readers, by the editors at the publisher, by the publishers themselves. That's where you're going to get all of the edges sanded down and all of the gaffes fixed. So if you want to see the author in actual motion, so to speak, you need to go a little further into the book. And that's why they're given page 112. And the booktuber Sean the Bookmaniac came up with the idea of making a sort of a tag out of it, where you pick 3 books off your shelf and just examine page 112 to see if you want to read more of the book. And of course, the best way to do it, the most accurate way to do it, is to have somebody else send you 3 excerpts, and then in a separate email that you'll open later, the identities of the books. And Sean just recently did that for me, and I'm gonna go through the excerpts, and then I will go into my email and I will find out what they are. So let's see what we have here. And you should see I wish you could see it. It'll never come out on camera here on MacBook to MacBook. But you should see the pen work that he does. In the margin of each of the excerpts, he writes the hashtag sign and then the number. Only he's been in Japan long enough so that the hashtag sign looks gorgeous. It looks calligraphy. But anyway, here's the first excerpt. Mrs. Barnaby had, moreover, in the most comprehensive sense of the phrase, or she had. Oh, sorry. Okay, let's start all over, shall we? Because this is kind of wordy. Mrs. Barnaby had, moreover, un esprit intrigant. In the most comprehensive sense of the phrase, for she would far rather have obtained any object she aimed at by means of her own maneuvering than by any simple concurrence of circumstances whatever. And this was perhaps the reason why, at the first moment of the proposal of Mr. Barnaby, whom she had, comparatively speaking, used no tricks to captivate, produced a less pleasurable effect upon her mind than a similar overture from any of the other innumerable military men whom she had so strenuously labored to win would have done. However, she was for this very reason happier than many other brides, for, in fact, she became daily more sensible of the substantial advantage she had obtained, and, on the whole, daily better pleased with her complacent husband. As her temper, though quietly and steadily selfish, was neither sour nor violent, this state of connubial happiness might have continued long, had not some untoward accidents occurred to disturb it. The first of these was the sudden and dangerous illness of Mrs. Compton, which was of a nature to render it perfectly impossible for Mr. and Mrs. Barnaby to continue their delightful little parties at home and abroad. The dying lady ceased not to implore her daughter to leave her. The dying lady. Okay, all right. This is. We're talking 1830s at least for this kind of diction. But let's do that again. The dying lady ceased not to implore her daughter not to leave her, in accents so piteous that Mr. Barnaby himself, notwithstanding his tender care for his lady's health, was the first to declare that she must remain with her. This heavy burden, however, did not inconvenience her long, for the seizure terminated in the death of the old lady about a week after its commencement. But even this, though acknowledged to be certainly a blessing and a happy release, could not restore the bride to the triumphant state of existence the illness of her mother had interrupted. For, in the first place, her deep mourning was by no means becoming to her, and she was perfectly aware of it, and her white satin and her silver fringe would be sure to turn yellow before she could wear them again. Besides, what was worse than all, a young attorney of Silverton married the daughter of a neighboring clergyman who, of course, was immediately installed in all a bride's honors, to the inexpressible mortification of Mrs. Barnaby. The annoyance which followed these vexations was, however, far more serious. The resources of poor Mr. Compton were completely exhausted. He had drawn out his last 100 from the funds, and actually remained possessed of no property whatsoever, except the nearly expired lease and the worn-out furniture of the house in which he lived. Mrs. Barnaby listened to the feeble old man's statement of his desperate position with dismay. She knew just enough of his affairs to be aware that it was very likely to be true, though with mistaken tenderness her mother had always refrained from representing their embarrassments to her daughter as being of the hopeless extent to which they really were. Okay. All right. Well, that's... It isn't familiar to me. It has to be old. So I would think that it would be familiar to me, and something about it is familiar to me. Not the names and not the plot, but the diction. The way the author, I don't know if you noticed it, it happens in virtually every sentence that the author will start the sentence and then interrupt himself. He'll say, like, as her temper, comma, though quietly and steadily selfish, comma, was neither, and then move on. Or, but even this, though acknowledged to be critically a blessing, certainly a blessing and a happy release, comma, could not restore the bride's triumphant state of affairs. For, comma, in the first place, comma, her deep mourning, it slows your reading to a crawl. I wouldn't read any more of this, I don't think. So that's excerpt number 1. That was not a success. Let's see what excerpt number 2 is. Okay, so this is excerpt number 2. So you're off? His father said to him when he came to make his adieu. Well, yes, I suppose so. A man has got so many things to look after, which he can't attend to down here. I don't know what they are, but you understand it all. I'm not going to ask you to stay. Does it ever occur to you that you may never see me again? What a question. It's one that requires an answer, at any rate. I'm not going to ask you to stay. Does it occur to you that you may never see me again? What a question. It's one that requires an answer, at any rate. It does occur to me, but not at all as probable. Why not probable? Because there's a telegraph wire from Tretton to London, and because the journey down here is very short. It also occurs to me to think so from what has been said by Sir William Brodrick. Of course, a man may die suddenly, especially when a surgeon's been at him. Okay. This excerpt I do know. I know it quite well. I have read this book probably 15 times. Tretton here refers to Tretton Park. And this is a conversation between a desperately ill old man and one of his 2 sons. The surgeon here is because the old man's state is so bad that a surgeon comes up to Tretton Park periodically and goes at him with knives. We're never told specifics of what's wrong with him, but it's pretty gruesome. And we don't get much. I'll talk more about the book when we get to the big reveal, because this one's not a surprise to me. But in this particular exchange, there isn't much to talk about, but you can certainly see one thing. And I'm trying not to prejudge here, because you're not supposed to know who the author is, but I do. You can see one thing for sure here. Notice there's almost nothing but dialogue. In fact, is there nothing but dialogue? Yeah, there's virtually nothing but dialogue. The first line says, so you're off, his father said when he came to make his adieu. And after that, it's all dialogue. The whole page is. And it works wonderfully. It's you can tell right away that the father, you can tell something of his personality. He's a little caustic and he's not at all sentimental. And you might get a hint of what the son is like, who is leaving his desperately ill father and doesn't seem all that concerned about it. So I would certainly read more. Let's do number 3. I'm a little, in a way, I'm oddly disappointed because one of these reveals is not a reveal for me. Oh my! But I'll talk about that later. I'm not going to go on. All right. So this is number 3. How do you know? I looked it up. It said about 7,500 if it has good documented history. That's amazing. Marianne made a series of little pleats in the duvet cover. She said, sadly, I've told him I can't have it. Have you? When? Tonight. I rang him after supper. He said that it was mine whenever I wanted it and would just wait at Allenham until I was ready. Margaret said, was he cross? No, of course not. Why would he be cross? He's never cross. Margaret watched her sister's pleading hand. You're pretty gone on him, aren't you? Marianne said nothing. She leaned forward a little more, and something swung out of the neck of her pajamas. They were pajamas Margaret covered, patterned in plaid, with rosebuds. What's that? And then the excerpt stops there, so we don't find out what fell out of her pajamas. I know what the answer would be if it were Deb. And that's our third excerpt, and it's fairly humdrum. I mean, it's just an interval that one sister has been offered a very expensive item by someone that her sister claims she's in love with, and she's turned it down, probably as a prelude to accepting both it and him. But it has no pizzazz, so I don't know that I would. I mean, it's not the disaster that the first one was, but it certainly doesn't have. I'm trying not to be prejudiced here, but it certainly doesn't have the oomph of the second one. That is our third excerpt. The number 2 and number 3 were almost entirely dialogue, and number 1 was not. So there we go. Now we're gonna see if the MacBook behaves itself here. We're gonna go to my email. We're gonna find out what these are, so that I can then bore you a little more before I let you go. So let's see here. We're gonna see if we can go to Sean's email. I have a special folder for him, far away from everyone else. Let's see here. Okay, here we go. So, let's see what they are. So number 1, the one that was a failure, was, oh no. Okay. All right. Okay. Oh, this is something clever that Sean did. This is funny. Number 1 is The Widow Barnaby by Frances Trollope from 1839. So I got the decade exactly right. I said the 1830s. This is Fanny Trollope, who was, the mother of the famous novelist Anthony Trollope, and who was an unbelievably prolific and extremely successful writer in her own right, in her own day. And I don't think I've ever read The Widow Barnaby. I'm pretty sure that I have not. I have read some of Fanny Trollope's novels. And I gotta say, they've all struck me the way this one did. As, as a novelist who maybe where the novel writing isn't the very best expression of her creative nature, so to speak. And you can see that, I think, because when in her letters, and especially in her nonfiction, especially Domestic Manners of the Americans, there's none of that halting business. It reads like butter. So that's the first one. And the second one is by Anthony Trollope. It's by her son, Anthony Trollope, who was one of 2 of her children who wrote. Anthony Trollope's brother also wrote. And it's Mr. Scarborough's Family is the name of the novel, from 1883. And it's the story of John Scarborough, who is wealthy and very sick, and who has decided that because his oldest son is a wastrel and an incredibly incurable gambler, he is going to get around the law of entail, which forces him to give all of his property inheritance to his oldest son. He's going to get around it by producing for the world. He produces for the world categorical documentary proof that his oldest son is a bastard, and therefore cannot inherit anything, and that therefore everything must go to his younger son. And he does it originally for 2 reasons. One, because he hates the whole law of entail. He hates the fact that anyone gets to tell him where he can and cannot leave his own possessions. And 2, he hates his son's gambling. He hates the weakness of it. And the younger son is not a gambler. So John Scarborough, for almost on his deathbed, he pretty much spends the whole novel on his deathbed, he decides to do that. And it's the second son that we're talking to in that excerpt. And as you can tell, the more John Scarborough gets to know his second son, the less he likes him. The second son is not a gambler, but it turns out that despite that fact, he's far less of a man, far less of a son to be proud of than the older son. And John Scarborough comes to dislike him more and more, especially since the younger son makes no pretense about where his own thoughts are. He makes it pretty clear that he's just eagerly, impatiently waiting for his father to die so that he can inherit Tretton Park and all and sundry, and start changing it to his own will. And I don't want to spoil things here because Mr. Scarborough's fan. I love Anthony Trollope. You all know that. I think he's absolutely fantastic. I've read him a million times. I don't want to spoil Mr. Scarborough's Family for any of you because I want you to go and read it yourself. But I gotta say, the plan that John Scarborough has to disinherit his elder son, it's not the only ace he has up his sleeve when it comes to his sons. He may very well be the most entertaining and most horrifying father in all of 19th century fiction. And that's saying something, because 19th century fiction was father-obsessed. You get halfway through Mr. Scarborough's Family, and you think, it's almost like Trollope is leading up to something, to a new development, but it couldn't be. He couldn't possibly pull that off. And he does. It's exactly what you think in the halfway point, and he does pull it off, and it's wonderful. Okay, so that's Mr. Scarborough's Family. Wonderful. And one of the big reasons why you've never read anything by any of the many, many novels by Trollope's brother, and one of the big reasons why you haven't read The Widow Barnaby or any other novels by Francis Trollope, is because of Anthony Trollope. It's a dark side of the Trollope family that even his biographers don't like to talk about, which is that he did his best to squelch the literary careers of his own family members. He kind of wanted to be the only Trollope on the literary scene. With his mother is one thing, but his brother, there's a Trollope literary study or a literary biography that has yet to be written, especially since most of them are incomplete. They don't talk about all of the Trollopes who've written. Like, for instance, Fanny Trollope's husband, her useless husband, actually was a writer his whole life. A Casaubon-style writer, but still a figure who deserves study and has never got it. As far as I know, I should probably contact the Trollope Society and see what they have to say. The third excerpt, the one that read like watered down Anthony Trollope, is indeed watered down Anthony Trollope. It's Sense and Sensibility by Joanna Trollope, who is his direct descendant, and who I have read all of her novels, hunting through them like a pig in the woods for the slightest truffle of Anthony Trollope's writing ability, and his ability to just take the reader aside and start telling them a ripping good story. And she just doesn't have it in her. Even The Spanish Lover, which I think is her most energetic novel, just doesn't have it in her at all. I picture what would happen. I've often wanted to write a story where somehow or other one of the manuscripts for one of her novels is somehow able to get to Anthony Trollope and what he would do with it. But one way or another, so Sean has very cleverly given me a Trollope trifecta here. We have Fanny Trollope, who clearly is writing for a generation and a literary sensibility that is completely gone. Harsh to say, nevertheless true. I absolutely love her, and Domestic Manners of the Americans has a bite to it that is very, very much along the lines of Mark Twain's Innocents Abroad and his other travel writing. It's very much of a temperament with that, and deserves to be remembered as long as that is. But her novels, she didn't have quite that pinch of genius that allows some writers to hoist their novels a bit above the literary sensibilities of their own time. Just a bit above, just enough above to survive into the next time and maybe the time after that. I don't think Joanna Trollope has it either. Anthony Trollope has it in spades. I don't care if you're the most Xbox loving 21st century millennial. If you start reading Mr. Scarborough's Family, you will keep reading and you will really like it. And it's not the only book of his that could affect you that way. So anyway, so that's this time around. Thank you very much, Sean. That was a lot of fun. So that is the page 112 tag, a Trollope trifecta for Trollope's #1 fan. I'm gonna sign off for now, but I'll see you soon. Thank you, BookTube.